There's a stone sitting in a quarry in Lebanon right now that modern engineers have openly admitted they cannot move with today's heaviest cranes. Not because the technology doesn't exist, but because there is simply no room on Earth to position the machinery required to lift it. It weighs more than 4 fully loaded Boeing 747s combined. It has been sitting there, half cut from the bedrock, for roughly 2,000 years, abandoned mid-task by builders who never explained why they stopped. Nearby, 3 other stones of similar size were somehow finished, moved and lifted into place inside a temple wall with a precision so exact that you cannot slide a blade between them. Nobody from that era left behind a single written record explaining how it was done. And the closer modern researchers look at the marks left behind on these stones, the stranger the questions become. This place is called Baalbek, and it sits in eastern Lebanon's Beqi Valley, roughly 42 miles northeast of Beirut, perched at an elevation of nearly 3,800 feet between 2 mountain ranges. The site itself has been occupied by humans for an extraordinarily long time, with archaeological evidence pointing to settlement dating back at minimum 11,000 years, long before anyone had invented writing, long before the first cities anywhere on Earth had risen. By around 2300 BC, Phoenician traders and worshippers had already established a religious center here dedicated to the god Baal. The namesake the site still carries today. Centuries later, when Alexander the Great's armies marched through this valley in 334 BC, the site was already known by a new name, Heliopolis, the City of the Sun, a title handed to it by the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, who held religious influence over the region at the time. But none of that, as significant as it is, explains the actual mystery sitting at the heart of this place. The real puzzle begins underground, hidden beneath layers of Roman ambition that came centuries later. When Julius Caesar made this region a Roman colony in 27 BC, construction began on what would eventually become one of the largest religious complexes anywhere in the empire, a process that continued for roughly the next 150 years. At the center of it all sat the Temple of Jupiter, dedicated to the supreme deity of the Roman pantheon, and by any measure it remains one of the most ambitious building projects the ancient world ever attempted. The temple itself stood on a raised platform roughly 90 meters by 50 meters, larger than a modern football field. I'm surrounded by 54 towering Corinthian columns, but here's where the story starts pulling you somewhere unexpected. Because the part of this complex that should be getting the most attention isn't the temple that's still standing. It's the foundation underneath it that nobody can fully explain. Beneath that elevated platform sits a retaining wall built from a series of monolithic stone blocks. And this is where the numbers stop making sense in a normal, comfortable way. The lowest course of this foundation is built from roughly 24 blocks, each weighing somewhere in the range of 300 tons. Sitting directly above those, forming the upper retaining course on the western side, are 3 even larger stones that have become globally famous under a single name, the Trilithon. Each of these 3 blocks measures roughly 19 meters, about 62 feet in length. Each one stands over 14 feet tall and stretches 12 feet thick. And each one weighs approximately 750 to 800 metric tons. Sit with that number for a second, because comparisons genuinely struggle to capture it. A single one of these blocks is heavier than many fully loaded commercial aircraft stacked together. 3 of them sit side by side, fitted into a wall roughly 20 feet above ground level, joined with such tightness that archaeologists have repeatedly confirmed you cannot insert a knife blade between them. But the Trilithon, as massive as it is, turns out to be only the beginning of what's actually buried at this site. About 800 meters from the temple complex sits the ancient quarry where all of this stone originally came from, and inside that quarry lie blocks that dwarf even the Trilithon itself. The first is known locally as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, a single block measuring over 19 meters long, still partially attached to the bedrock, weighing somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 tons. A second stone, discovered in the same quarry decades later and known as the Stone of the South, has been measured at weights ranging up to roughly 1,200 to 1,650 tons, depending on which engineering survey you consult, making it one of the largest single-cut stone blocks ever identified anywhere on the planet. And then, in 2014, something happened that genuinely startled the archaeological community. A team from the German Archaeological Institute, digging deeper into the same quarry, uncovered a third, previously unknown monolith buried beneath centuries of accumulated debris. This one came to be called the Forgotten Stone, and current estimates place its weight at somewhere around 1,500 tons. Think about what that actually means. A block that size had been sitting completely hidden, unrecorded, undiscovered, for roughly 2,000 years, directly beneath ground that tourists and researchers had been walking across for generations without anyone realizing what was underneath their feet. Here's where the central question of this entire mystery starts to sharpen into focus, and it's a question that has genuinely divided engineers, archaeologists, and historians for well over a century. How exactly were stones this heavy quarried, transported, and positioned by anyone in the ancient world using tools and machinery that, according to every surviving historical record, simply weren't capable of handling that kind of weight? This isn't a question dreamed up by fringe theorists looking for an excuse to invoke aliens. This is a question that serious, credentialed archaeologists openly admit they cannot answer with complete confidence, even now, even after more than a century of dedicated study at this exact site. To understand why this gap in our knowledge is so genuinely troubling, you need to understand what we actually know about Roman engineering capability during this period. The standing columns, still visible at the Temple of Jupiter today, offer a critical clue. Those columns stand roughly 20 meters tall, built not from a single piece of stone, but from cylindrical drum sections stacked on top of each other, with each drum weighing up to roughly 60 tons. According to the architectural and engineering record, individual Roman cranes of this era were not capable of lifting stones significantly heavier than that 60-ton range. Read that again, because it matters enormously for what comes next. The largest stones the Romans could reliably lift with cranes topped out somewhere around 60 tons. The trilithon stones sitting in the foundation below those very columns weigh roughly 13 times that amount. The forgotten stone, still sitting in the quarry, weighs roughly 25 times that amount. Something doesn't add up here, and the people who study this site for a living are the first to admit it. The most widely accepted explanation among archaeologists and structural engineers is that these enormous blocks were never actually lifted in the way you might imagine. Instead, the leading theory holds that workers used a combination of wooden rollers, prepared earthen embankments, and an enormous coordinated labor force to slide and roll the stones into position rather than hoisting them through the air. According to this theory, the quarry itself sat at a slightly higher elevation than the temple site, meaning the stones could be moved primarily downhill, using gravity as an ally rather than fighting against it the entire way. Some on-site historical accounts and modern informational displays at the quarry suggest a labor force numbering in the hundreds, organized into coordinated teams operating pulley systems to drag the stones slowly along a specially prepared flattened track. This is not an unreasonable explanation. It relies on real, demonstrated ancient engineering principles, rather than speculation about lost technology. But here's the problem that keeps this question alive, even today. Despite extensive study, no definitive physical evidence of the specific ramps, tracks, or lifting apparatus used for the largest of these stones has ever been conclusively identified at the site. The theory is plausible. It is not proven. And this is exactly the kind of gap, the space between a reasonable theory and definitive proof, where the most provocative claims about this site have managed to take root and spread for decades. Some independent researchers and popular authors, including figures like Graham Hancock, have argued that the foundation layer beneath the Roman temple, the trilithon and the stones below it, may actually predate Roman construction by thousands of years, with some estimates floated as high as 12,000 years old. The argument typically rests on visual differences between the foundation stones and the masonry built above them, along with claims of weathering patterns that suggest a much older age for the lower layer. Now here's where it's important to be precise about what is actually established versus what remains speculative. Mainstream archaeological dating based on architectural style, construction technique, stratigraphic context, and even a surviving graffito found on one of the temple's column drums indicating the structure was substantially complete by around AD 60, places the entire trilithon and the platform beneath it firmly within the Roman period, likely beginning construction in the 1st century BC. The 11,000-year history of human settlement at this location is real and well documented. The claim that the megalithic stones themselves are that old is not supported by the archaeological dating evidence currently available, and the broader academic community has not accepted it. That distinction matters because conflating the two is exactly how a genuine, fascinating archaeological mystery gets transformed into something far less credible. But strip away the most extreme claims, and there's still something genuinely unresolved sitting at the heart of this story, and it deserves serious attention rather than dismissal. Visitors and researchers examining the surface of these massive stones have repeatedly documented sets of long, parallel scratch marks running across multiple blocks throughout the site, including on the foundation stones themselves. These marks have drawn comparisons to tooling patterns found at other megalithic sites scattered across the ancient world, including the unfinished Stele block at China's Yangshan Quarry and certain pre-Nabatean sections of Petra in Jordan. Now, before this comparison gets oversold, it's worth being honest about what the Yangshan stone actually is. Far from being an unexplained relic of some lost ancient civilization, the Yangshan quarry block is a documented Ming Dynasty project from the early 15th century, intended as a monumental stele for an imperial tomb, abandoned because its creators eventually realized it was simply too massive to transport. It has a known origin, a known purpose, and a known builder. Comparing its tool marks to Baalbek doesn't connect two ancient mysteries together. It mostly just tells you that cutting enormous stone blocks tends to leave similar physical traces, regardless of which century or which civilization is doing the cutting. Still, the question of exactly which tools produced certain marks at Baalbek specifically remains a topic of genuine, ongoing debate rather than settled fact, and that uncertainty is precisely what keeps drawing researchers back to this site generation after generation. A Russian independent research group calling itself the Laboratory of Alternative History has spent years photographing and analyzing surface details across the complex, focusing heavily on the precision of certain joints and corner finishes on the megalithic blocks. Their findings, which have not been published through peer-reviewed academic channels and have not been independently verified by mainstream archaeological institutions, claim to have identified edge lines on certain stones measured at a fraction of a millimeter in consistency, a level of precision they argue would be difficult to achieve without modern measuring or cutting technology. It's worth treating this claim with appropriate caution. Extraordinary precision claims that haven't passed through peer review and replication by independent teams should be read as an open question rather than an established fact, no matter how compelling the photographs look. What can be said with more confidence is that the overall craftsmanship on display at Baalbek, regardless of exactly how it was achieved, represents a level of stonework precision that genuinely impresses modern structural engineers who have studied the site directly. Now, layer onto all of this one more genuinely verified, well-documented detail that tends to get lost beneath the more sensational claims, because it deserves to be the centerpiece of this story rather than a footnote. The 54 towering columns that once surrounded the Temple of Jupiter, several of which still stand today, were not made from local stone at all. They were carved from pink granite quarried specifically at Aswan in southern Egypt, a documented fact confirmed across multiple archaeological surveys of the site. That granite then had to travel an extraordinary distance, well over 1,000 miles by some calculations, transported by river barge down the Nile, across open Mediterranean waters by ship, and finally hauled overland across the mountain ranges separating the Lebanese coast from this inland valley. This is not disputed or speculative. This is documented Roman engineering and logistics on a scale that should, on its own, command genuine awe without needing any embellishment about lost civilizations or ancient machines. The fact that the Romans were willing to move single-piece granite columns measuring roughly 20 meters tall and over 2 meters in diameter across more than 1,000 miles of sea and mountain terrain tells you everything about how seriously this empire took this particular religious site, situated notably on the remote eastern edge of their entire territory. And here is where the story takes one more turn that most casual retellings completely skip over. In the year 560 AD, more than 5 centuries after construction at Baalbek originally began, the Byzantine emperor at the time, the very same Justinian, whose name is attached to one of history's deadliest pandemics, ordered 8 of these columns physically removed from the temple complex and shipped to Constantinople, where they were installed in the construction of the Hagia Sophia, a building that still stands today as one of the most architecturally significant structures on Earth. Pieces of Baalbek, quarried in Egypt, erected in Lebanon, are sitting right now inside a building in modern Istanbul, connected by a chain of decisions made across multiple empires and multiple centuries. That single fact alone should tell you something important about how this site was viewed, even by people living closer to its construction than we are. It wasn't treated as some forgotten relic. It was treated as a source of material so valuable that an emperor was willing to disassemble part of it and ship the pieces across the empire for his own monumental project. So where does that actually leave the central mystery, the question that brought you into this story in the first place? The honest answer is more unsettling than a clean resolution would be. We know with reasonable confidence when construction at this specific layer of the site likely began. We know roughly how heavy these stones are, because they've been measured repeatedly using modern surveying tools. We know the Romans were capable of extraordinary feats of engineering and logistics elsewhere in their empire, moving multi-ton granite columns over 1,000 miles being just one proven example. And what we genuinely do not know, with full certainty, is the exact specific method used to move and position the very largest of these stones, the trilithon, and the still larger blocks abandoned in the nearby quarry. The leading theory involving rollers, ramps, and massive coordinated labor forces remains plausible and grounded in real engineering principles, but it has never been definitively proven through physical evidence found at the site itself. That gap between plausible theory and confirmed fact is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. And that gap is exactly why this site continues to attract serious researchers, alongside fringe theorists, why German archaeological teams are still actively excavating this quarry as recently as 2014, and why nobody currently knows for certain how many additional megalithic blocks might still be sitting buried beneath unexcavated sections of ground in that same valley. Every confirmed discovery at this site, including the forgotten stone unearthed barely over a decade ago, has come from ground that people had walked across for generations without realizing what was underneath them. If a 1,500-ton stone block could remain completely hidden and undocumented until 2014, the obvious question becomes impossible to ignore. What else is still down there, waiting, in a valley that humans have continuously occupied for 11,000 years, directly beneath a temple complex that even its own builders apparently couldn't fully explain in writing? The quarry is still being studied, the questions are still open, and somewhere beneath the Becca Valley there may be stones larger than anything anyone has measured yet, sitting in the dark, waiting for the next excavation to finally bring them into the light.